Since emerging from the collapsing Soviet Union as an independent state in 1991, Georgia has long been in favor of moving closer west and has even enshrined its aspiration to join NATO and the EU in its constitution. So when the ruling pro-Russian Georgian Dream Party paused EU accession talks in November, protesters took to the streets, where they have remained since. My guest on Conflict Zone from the Munich Security Conference is Salome Zourabichvili, who has become the face of that protest movement. She maintains that she is the only legitimate president of Georgia, even after being forced from office following disputed elections that the opposition says were rigged with Moscow's help. The stakes are high. Will Georgia be lost to Russia or continue on its path to the EU? Salome Zourabichvili, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin by asking you for your reaction to Trump's plan to negotiate with Putin over Ukraine. Georgia, like Ukraine, knows what it's like to be in the crosshairs of Russia, having been invaded in 2008 at the hint that you might join NATO. 20% of your territory is still under Moscow's control. What do you think talks with Putin will mean for Ukraine?
Well, that nobody knows to start with. But what I think is that it should not be, and I've seen that tendency, interpreted immediately like a victory for Putin, that he will win the peace talks. He has not won the war. 3 years for Russia not being able to achieve its objectives of this war of aggression is not a victory, and the victory in the peace talks is not that easy. It's not because they start with a type of play between Trump and Putin, who pleases the other, compliments the others. That's only the very first stage, and that's not finished. And it's very interesting to see that Putin is already preparing for trying to win the stage after the peace talks, because he's not sure to win the peace talks. And the stage after the peace talks is what was mentioned today and already a few days ago, talking about elections in Ukraine. Well, we have been the country where Russia has tested the new hybrid strategy of how to win over a country without a war, by using the abusing the democratic means.
And I would like to ask you a little bit more about what's going on domestically in your country, but first...
That's not domestic, that's what I want to say. The winning of elections in Georgia through hybrid methods by Russia is not domestic. It's what Russia is testing in Georgia, is testing in Romania, is testing in Moldova, and will tomorrow test in Ukraine after not having won the war and not having won the peace talks.
How high is your fear of Georgia being used as a bargaining chip in a larger geopolitical game?
I don't think that we're going, again, things never repeat themselves exactly. These fears of a new Yalta and things like that, it never happens like that. I think we would better be concentrating on the real threats. And what I've been describing, that Russia is now testing new hybrid strategies that are much easier to conceive for an ex-KGB, or there is no ex-KGB agent like Putin, than for him to win wars and military operations, because that's not his past and his ability. So he's going back to what he knows, and that's hybrid strategies. And we see that everywhere. Cyber attacks in the Baltic states, election attacks in Georgia and in Romania, even if the vice president maybe has not seen it exactly in those conditions. But that's what is happening in Europe, and for which we have all to be prepared, instead of thinking about threats that belong to the former century.
Protesters have been out on the streets of Georgia since November. They are calling for new free and fair elections after allegations that the ruling Georgian Dream Party rigged the last vote with Moscow's help, as you've highlighted there. If Putin is brought out from the cold, what does this mean for that call for new elections, do you think, for democracy and an EU future for your country? Is it looking more remote or distant from what you've been hearing in the past few days?
from what I've been hearing the past few days, we are at a standstill within the country and at a standstill outside of the country. At a standstill within the country because the proxy regime that has now become a Russian model regime with repressive laws of all kinds, not only the initial Russian law, but offshore laws, repression of the media. On all directions, we have a very dictatorial regime. And there is a standstill between this regime and the protests on the streets. Nobody is giving in. They're increasing the measures of repression. And the protesters, after 78 days on the streets, are still there and will be there. And it's very important to understand why. Because it is not a political crisis, because it is not a question of who won or didn't win the elections, because it's a realization that Russia is trying again through a different means to reconquer, to take the domination over Georgia. And that's something that the Georgian population will not accept. That's why it's existential as a fight. And that's why if you interrogate people on the streets, their answer today is to answer to the end.
You have accused the ruling Georgian Dream Party of steering a country toward a Russian path while presenting a facade of European integration.
There is no more facade.
There's no more facade. There's really, because, the ruling, I have to ask you, the ruling Georgian Dream Party's prime minister has said that, and I'm quoting here, Georgia has no space for restoring diplomatic relations with Russia. Do you think he's lying?
Well, lies are one part of Russian model regime. And we have seen many lies. For instance,
so Georgia is going into Russia's arms.
Yes, I will give you an example. The Russian law that everybody has heard about, the foreign influence law, so-called, was presented, provoked massive demonstrations in 2023, and was repelled by the Georgian Dream, saying never again. We understood the population, we will take away this law, and we won't represent it ever. Said by the Prime Minister and said by all the members of the government. Exactly 1 year after, and after having received the candidate status to the European Union, they reintroduced the law, lies, hence, and received the same mass demonstrations as an answer. And after the elections, which were carried under banners that were presenting Georgian flags and European flags from Georgian Dream. After that, 1 month after the elections, we had the declaration of the Prime Minister, the statement, very formal, saying that Georgia was going to stop its path towards negotiations of adhesion to the European Union, which means, again, lies. You've lied to your electorate about the fact that you are still going toward the European Union, and you take the decision that has really pushed out people on the streets in a much more massive way than even the fact of rigging the elections.
And while you and the protesters are accusing them of lies, they have positioned themselves as the only party to avoid another war with Russia, a neighbor already occupying parts of the country, as we've been talking about. Why do you think some might believe that message?
Because for a country that has been invaded and aggressed by Russia so many times during the past 2 centuries. It's very easy, and that's a very Russian propaganda theme, that the West, the Americans, the Europeans want the war, that they are the global war party, so-called. But when you present and you look at the images of the war in Ukraine and you tell people that this might happen, there is not many people, unless they start really reflecting, that can say when living as a neighbor to Russia, that this will never happen. You cannot promise that to the people. So this propaganda, and the Russians know very well this, how to use these propaganda machines, and they know very well at the same time the mentality of the people that were living under the Soviet rule. So they know how to use, where to use, And that's something that works to a certain extent.
What does the new Trump administration mean for what some have called an appeasement strategy that Georgian Dream has toward Russia? What are you hoping from the Americans? What are you hoping from Trump? Because, for example, and I'd just like to throw this out there, that the Munich Security Report says that the U.S. is no longer perceived as an anchor of stability, but rather a risk to be hedged against. But you need the U.S. support, don't you? Has it just become more complicated?
We need the U.S. support. We need the European support, but more than support, we need the Europeans and the US to understand that this is where the challenge is today to their interests. Because the challenge in Georgia, it's not only a challenge of elections and of a new hybrid strategy of Russia, it's directly a challenge to the presence of the European Union and of the United States in the Caucasus. That means all the next stages of big projects. And it's a direct challenge to the Black Sea. Georgian Dream, together with Russians, because that's something that is not done without the support or the approval of the Russians, is bringing China in the Black Sea. That is the American interest and the European interest. We're going to defend ourselves to the end, as I said. But I think that Europeans and Americans should better defend their own interests.
We'll talk a little bit more about what the Europeans can do. But I mean, what can you realistically squeeze out of the Trump administration? You were in Washington for the inauguration.
Which was not really the place to discuss future strategies. But I present.
You were there for the inauguration, and you know, Trump is very much known for this transactional style of leadership that he has. And I'm just wondering how it is that you can convince him that Georgia, relatively small country, matters to him.
Well, exactly for what I've said, because it's the American interest beyond the Georgian interest, which are for us very, very clear. It's whether there is an interest of the United States to keep the Black Sea as an open sea, which it was until the beginning of the war in Ukraine, whether it's the interest of the Americans to see China taking over a port in the Black Sea, which is in the process of negotiations, whether it's in the interest of an America that wants to appear as a strong today player, to appear that it's giving in to Russia and giving to Russia back the Caucasus as a whole, because that's what will happen also to Armenia if Georgia is given so easily to Russia without a cost. So that's a question that the Americans should ask themselves. And as I said when I was there, I think that Georgia can be either a solution and show that you can resolve this crisis with the help of the Americans, with the help of the European Union, without any cost to anyone, or whether you want it to become a problem.
Do you have any positive signals that they're hearing that message? Because
No. I don't think that there is any today decision made in the administration, whether it's very clear for the war on Ukraine that there is no decision taken. There have been testing grounds sent out in different directions, and the Putin-Trump conversation is part of that. There are the statements of the Minister of the Secretary of Defense and other statements that and unpredictability is probably one of the main instruments that the Trump administration is using for its next strategy. So let's keep cool and not make conclusions on the things that we hear here and there, because it's not a consistent and coherent strategy yet.
Let's talk a little bit more about the situation with the Europeans. And we just also want to mention that, you know, your claim to the presidency has the backing of opposition groups and also the EU and some pan-European parties as well. However, you have also said that Europe has been slow to wake up and slow to react. What do you want to see from it now?
I think that there should be more, again, I don't think that anyone in Georgia, having the history that we've had, in 2008, nobody realized that Russia was testing its military power in Georgia to see whether it could use it again against its neighbors. And not having seen it in 2008, we've seen 2014 Crimea, we've seen then the aggression against Ukraine in 2022. And the same thing is happening. Today, we have an aggression in the form of using democratic instruments, elections, by Russia, using propaganda, using the freedom of election, using social networks to try to win us at our own game, which is democratic game. Not seeing it in Georgia, not reacting to it, means that you do not react to it in Romania, where you have a TikTok election. You don't react to it in Moldova, where the elections were saved thanks to the diaspora, but they were under strict pressure. And elections in Ukraine would be very, very dangerous. So that, and not only Ukraine, not only the countries around the Black Sea, that's the first strategy, but that might happen anywhere, including in your own country. So I think that what I'm trying to portray here is not that Georgia needs more support for itself, because again, as I said, the Georgians are going to go to the end. They will defend their future and their independence, as they've done all the time in the past. But they want the Europeans to understand what is happening. They want to see that the picture, the strategic picture that is shaping itself is understood, and that there is reaction to that. I do not need to be defended. I understand that the European Union basically defends presidents when they are in exile, and I don't intend to be in exile. I know that the European Union is not going to decide for us to set up new elections.
You must have an ask, though, when you go into those rooms with European politicians. You must have an ask. I mean, what do you think is the thing that is really going to put pressure on Ivanishvili, who is, this billionaire businessman who is the leading force behind Georgian Dream? Is it sanctions? Is it economic pressure? And are you optimistic that you will get those things, especially considering that you do have some members in the EU that, and I'm thinking of Hungary, namely, for example, who actually congratulated Georgian Dream when they had the elections this past fall.
Yes, but there are a majority of countries, not a majority only, beyond Hungary and Slovakia. Nobody else is having any relations with the current government. So that's a very big achievement, this de facto non-recognition policy, which is putting a lot of stress on the Georgian Dream, because their whole foreign policy today is trying to find someone with whom to shake hands. That's the whole content of the foreign policy. So it's working. It's having an effect. At the same time, there are sanctions which are having effects, both Americans and even the limited sanctions that for the time being the European Union as a collective sanctions has imposed, but individual European countries are also beefing up to sanctions. So is Great Britain, and that's working. Of course, it doesn't change things from one day to the others, but we see the business community becoming nervous because they understand the extent of that. We see that it's affecting some of the people, including in the law enforcement agencies. That is a process that will probably take time and that nobody knows how it will be achieved. But again, the Georgian people are not only counting either on sanctions or on economic restrictions on the Georgian dream. They're also basically counting on themselves.
Georgians, as you have been mentioning, they've been rallying since November. They're still protesting. They're doing it despite reports of violence and arrest. How long do you think that the protesters and opposition can continue with the government introducing tougher penalties, longer jail sentences, bigger fines? Because it's getting more dangerous and the consequences more severe.
It's a standoff.
How long can it continue?
Well, the same can be asked. How long can a regime that doesn't have the support of its own population, that is isolated from the outside world, that does not govern because the only decisions they have been taking since the elections, and that's 3 months, have been repressive measures. They're not governing the country. They're only punishing the protesters. So that's not a very strong way of governing. On the other side, it's clear that the repressive measures are having their toll on the protesters. But we are entering months that are going to be less cold, more spring, and there is a very strong determination among the protesters who are not organized by the political opposition. They are self-organized, and as we know, this type of movements, when they are more spontaneous and very diverse and not with clear centers, the authorities do not know where they have to hit, who do they have to arrest to stop it. So it's a standoff, and nobody knows the outcome.
Are you willing to be that leader?
You're
seen as that leader.
I am that.
You're seen as the face of the protest movement.
I am the leader of the country that is defending its independence. I'm the leader outside. I'm the leader inside. I'm not directly the leader of the protest because, again, as I said, it is a self-generated movement, and that's the way it defends itself the best.
You have vowed to continue this struggle until Georgia has a free and decent government. It could take a long time. Do you despair?
To the end.
Do you ever despair?
I think I don't have the right when people on the streets are continuing their fight. And when we have the history that we have in Georgia of defending the independence of this country, otherwise this country would not be existing today in the region where it is, where we have known all the empires that have existed practically coming in and getting out of Georgia. So if we survived, it means that the resilience is something that is a Georgian know-how.
Do you fear for your personal safety, for arrest?
No, I think that today the fear, and there is no fear. If we talk with the people on the streets, even they do not fear the arrest, the fines, which are very high for people that hardly have a revenue. But I don't have a right to fear if they do not fear.
How can you make sure that the situation in Georgia is not forgotten? Because, I mean, we're here at the Munich Security Conference. All eyes have been on the United States, on Ukraine. How do you make sure that you keep Georgia at the forefront?
By being here. It is not on the front page, and it will never be on the front page because it's a small country. But I think that the message that I brought here and that I delivered to almost everyone is that we are the other face of the coin of the war in Ukraine. When Russia sees that it cannot win through war or through peace talks in Ukraine, it is testing, again, in Georgia, another alternative strategy that we should be looking at. And that is my message. And I think that everybody will be better off by listening to the message, even if it's not directed to come and support us and help us. We'll do that.
Georgian protesters, and I just have to ask you about this, before we go, Georgian protesters have been voicing worries that their country might become a Russian vassal like Belarus, for example. How high do you see the risk of that happening?
Well, that's what I've been describing. That's why they are on the streets. It's not because one party won the elections against another part of Georgia. It's because they have this sense that they're fighting for something that is their own existence. And I will not finish, because I see the time running, without saying that there is a call, which I brought also here from the Georgian media that are in a very difficult situation today after the cuts in both US aid and yet not real support from the European institutions to free media. And there is a woman journalist that is in jail and is hunger striking for now 35 days. And that
very prominent journalist.
Support of the European journalists. I think she deserves that because she's a very courageous lady.
How much do you think what happens in Ukraine will determine Georgia's future?
We're very linked. We have had the same past. And we have experienced Russia in the same direct manner many times. So we're not going exactly through the same experiences. We've had the war in 2008, as I said, and that now we have two occupied territories. They have had occupied territories. So we understand well, and I think that we know well what Russia is, and that both Ukraine and Georgia, as well as the Baltic states, as well as Poland, can be countries that teach the other Europeans and the Americans what Russia is about, what it is about to negotiate with Russia. Because we've had negotiations, we have had the first independence. At that time, we signed the peace deal with Russia, who recognized the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of that Georgia in 1920. And in February 1921, Russia invaded Georgia.
You have highlighted also here the peaceful nature, actually, of the protests. But, it has been quite a while. It's been, 3 months now since individuals have been on the streets, not demanding a revolution, as you've highlighted, but just demanding the transition.
Not breaking one window.
How much longer can that continue?
As long as it's needed.
But the peaceful nature of the protest, surely people must be frustrated.
There is no alternative. Even 3 months, it's a very long time if you want the movement to turn into violence. And many European capitals know that if this movement is so peaceful, it's because people are so well aware that we live in a geopolitical environment where we cannot rock the boat. That's why the demand is only a demand about new elections. It has not been even once to say we want to overthrow the government. Which government would like to hear these demands? Because then they would say, well, it's a revolution. We have the right to use any forms to repress it. No, it's a peaceful movement that has remained and will remain peaceful.
Salome Zourabichvili, thank you so much for joining us on Conflict Zone.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.